Hey everyone, welcome back to Ground Zero. This is episode 15. Today we have Ludwig. Before I go dive deep into the podcast, there's this thought which was quite revolving in the mind. The internet created a new kind of engineer, self taught, taste driven, tool native, adversarial to credentials, and now amplified by agents. And I think Ludwig is probably the clearest case study of that archetype. And this episode is framed around everything taste, agency, abstraction, and intelligence. If I have to introduce Ludwig, Ludwig is a 31-year-old programmer with no formal education, dropped out in seventh grade. Yeah, quite abnormal. Started programming around 10, began working at 15, and later worked on distributed systems for companies serving millions of users. You might know him from his writing on systems programming, ML, intelligence, mathematics, and his presence on X. Welcome, Ludwig.
Thank you. Wow, that's a very nice intro. Yeah, I'm very happy to talk. I think the some of the things you shared with me about this is they're going to be very interesting. So I'm eager.
Let's go. So before we dive deep into the whole story, I'm curious, what are you most excited about these days?
Wow, that's a hard question. I think my interests change, very quickly. They seem to be circling around some things that stay the same, but I over the last 2 years I can see that I've shifted from different kind of fields and domains to different things, and some underlying structure is shared between all of them. I'm interested, like I think many people are, in why are things the way they are, and why do they work at all? Why is anything around, and how do we work, and things like that. And so I think that's like probably the highest level like interest. It's like I'm just curious about why are things the way they are. And then I think actually X and just the being part of the discussion on ML and agents and models getting increasingly better and better, that has provoked a lot of thoughts, and shifted my interest. I think I had a different notion of what it means to understand, or to for something to be intelligent, or a system to be described as intelligent. A couple years ago, before I was forced to to think about it, because there are pretty crazy things happening, and it's like but at the same time I have intuitions that, okay, well, these words are not very accurate, or maybe this is something different. But yeah, in the process I'm diving into a bunch of stuff. But to answer the question maybe clearly, over the last year I think I've been ever more interested in mathematics, higher level mathematics if possible. And I had some runs with category theory before, but I think it really clicked for me maybe late 2024, where I really became more interested. And I think I wasn't gestated enough that I could have gotten into it before. And so now I can. And also on the way, I mean, it's nice to do some pop mathematics and read about mathematics, but unfortunately that's not all that. I mean, if that's all you do, then maybe you're not really doing mathematics. And so I've spent some time trying to formalize my math skills to some extent. And also philosophy of mathematics I think is very interesting. So that's been one of my interests. But overall, I think my interest is in trying to make sense of what I care about. So basically, that's the answer is I'm trying to make sense of what are my interests most of the time. Yeah.
Great. I believe this is not just about mathematics. Like your life has been this series of seemingly disconnected obsessions, I think. I mean, you started with building PHP websites as a teenager, then systems programming, then distributed systems. I was reading and there was this concept of Wittgenstein and philosophy of language, then Levin's biology and morphogenesis. You talked about category theory and abstract algebra, then automated theorem
Yeah.
proving with Lean4, and the recent one, the FE, for instance, free energy principle. But all these arcs seem to be equivalent up to isomorphism, some sort of isomorphism. So they're all
Yeah.
asking the same question from, I think, different angles. So what is the one question you have been asking in different languages this whole time, just being going through this arc?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That like I think many of these things, or at least I have the need to understand things as if they were somewhat similar. They shared some structure or properties, and I think many of these things are different ways to probe into, like different representations of maybe some underlying like real things, for sure. Like it's not so many differences between like distributed system and like morphogenesis, where you have like a collection of cells without a central any kind of central coordinator. And yet in a decentralized system like this that's distributed, they communicate and manage to orchestrate themselves into reaching some state that they wish to be in. But yeah, what is the underlying question? I'm not sure. I think the question changes all the time. In that I realized that maybe maybe the question didn't make any sense in the first place. I think, for example, when I joined Dex, which was almost 2 years ago now, when I started being active, one of the big things I spent my time, reading about was like, what is intelligence? I was interested in like, okay, what is intelligence? What does it mean? I mean, there's many like kind of camps and human definitions of intelligence, but I was trying to like find out if there's like some kind of formal, like approach to defining what intelligence is. And so I got into things that I had read about before, but from a new lens about like, compression, the capacity to like predictive power, things like that. And then had some, that was very useful. That was very nice. It fleshed out, one of my, it fleshed out the question that I was trying to ask in that, okay, well, maybe this is like, just one angle of like the question that I don't know that what I really meant to ask is what is intelligence? Maybe I'm asking something else. So anyway, to, cut it short, I don't know that there is a single question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I have a lot of questions all the time. And every time I answer them, I find that the question wasn't very good. So yeah.
Makes sense. I mean, yeah, that is something I think is very fundamental to. I mean, when you're exploring some certain of like five, six, seven, eight topics, and every time the niche is different:
Yeah.
biology, mathematics, category theory, algebra, energy principles. So I mean, yeah, it's a lot of them. Awesome. So let's go back to the initial story, the origin story. So
Yeah.
you dropped out in seventh grade and started programming around 10. So my first
Yeah.
question is just what made you drop out in seventh grade? Because this is very very interesting to know. Like this is not very normal to
Yeah.
hear.
That's yeah. Well, yeah. Usually not a lot of middle school dropouts around for sure. I mean, I dropped out of middle school because it wasn't a good environment for me to be in school. I think it could have been in some other potential realities that I would have been a great academic and I would have loved to be in school. But with the way my life went, it just didn't really make sense. I didn't attend school very much from around 10 years old to 15, and I retook 2 years. So at 15 years old when I dropped out, I was like with the 13-year-olds. Yeah, because of lack of attendance and some behavioral issues, I didn't enjoy school very much. I mean, I liked the social aspect of it. I enjoyed being with people, and there was a lot. There were a lot of games to play, like social games, various kind of things that I could do. But I didn't really like. I didn't understand. I mean, what I wanted when I was a kid, I remember very clearly. That thought formed at around like 10 to 11. That's when I kind of started getting this like model. Is like I wanted to have some money to not be poor, and and it didn't look like the things that I did at school would do like would do much for me. And I was listening to like Kanye West, and then later on like Drake and stuff, and they had chains and cars, and they didn't seem to go to school too much. I was like, okay, what am I doing over here? And so yeah, I ended up dropping out. My mom was very amenable. I think she didn't really have much of a choice. Also, I mean, at this point, I had very poor attendance, and I was in and out of social care and things like that. So still, she did take a leap of faith on me. She was very she was pretty important to me, even having the capacities to like make something out of myself. After in that, like I used her as like a test bed. Quite a lot. I talked to my mom a tremendous amount of time when I was young to test my explanations, to see like, if I understood these things. I'd run up to her and I would explain all these things. By then, by 15, we had done that for a while. I'd been interested in things for a while. And so she was like, okay, well, it's, it doesn't seem completely impossible that he would, that he would make it. And so she took a leap of faith on me, and it worked out okay. Yeah. So that's why I dropped out. It just didn't fit very much. In retrospect, I will say, and I thought that throughout my 20s, but especially in the last few years, that I do think formal education has a really important part to play for many people. It would have been very beneficial for me in retrospect. There are many things that make me the way I am that are both good and very bad in even the way that I learn things. And I think formal education could have been really good for me, but it wasn't to be, and I found out I did my own thing instead. So yeah.
I mean, out of curiosity, if I have to connect the dots here, so isn't this path of yours not going for formal education has led up to a point where you are at a position that your natural interest coming up for certain for these lot of topics? I mean,
Yeah.
because when normal a child grows to a student to a college grad, they follow a certain set of steps. and which is
Yeah,
very much defined. I mean, if you have to go to math stream or science stream or biological stream, you have to follow this certain path. But since you are not in a formal, you have not gone through a formal route, so
yeah,
that has been led to a certain this kind of behavior where where you are generally interested in a lot of topics.
yeah, yeah. And I'm lucky that even before X, I think I was lucky that, like, the internet is a very useful tool, regardless of like having a Twitter account, to meet people from different
Yep.
walks of life and different spheres. When I was young, I spent a lot of time on 4chan. That was a pretty big part of my cultural like upbringing, and I got to meet a lot of people there. I made some lifelong friends, and then just interacted with a plethora of people, and I could that already gave me some access, or I started understanding that I could have access to people if I wanted to, and so I could I didn't have to. There is a danger in being interested in a bunch of stuff and doing things on your own, and not having any friction with the world. Then you're like you're on
Yeah.
the verge of psychosis. Like it's not so you do have to talk with the people who are in these fields, and like and you have to be respectful in that, like most of the time you don't have many interesting things to say. You're not in that field, but yeah, I think that was very useful. And then X obviously has been also helpful. I've been able to discuss things with a bunch of people and meet them, and go to conferences and things like that, and that's been nice. It also fills me very often with which is something I never had before, but I have it much more than ever now, is like some imposter syndrome, because I've spread myself very thin to some extent, and
Sure.
so it's very hard. It's very hard to like to feel like I'm capable of backing up all of the things that I think about, because it's a very broad range, and it's okay. It's not expected. I don't pretend to be an expert on anything that I really talk about. There are some things where I have experience, and some where I just have a lot of thoughts and maybe
Sure.
played with them. But yeah, that's been kind of interesting in that I think I never felt imposter syndrome. I think when I was young, I had a very sharp sense of that I was capable of thinking, and I was capable of getting what I want from an early age, in relationships, and interpersonal relationships and stuff like that. And then when I started programming, I didn't have any special talent. I think a very average 10-year-old, if given the kind of time and environment that I had, which is like a lot of personal time on his own, would have basically, it was a very like normal pace. Basically, I wasn't a competitive programmer by 13-year-old or anything like that. But still, I sort of like not having divine programming skills from the get-go, I definitely didn't feel like an imposter, even though I didn't have credentials, I didn't have all that stuff, because I thought I understood, like the kind of games that are being played, and that, like there are some people that are maybe 10 years older than me, 13 years older than me, who apply for the same positions as I do, and I can use that as an advantage. Well, it doesn't really matter how good I am, because I can portray myself as like, well, I'm only
Yeah.
13, and clearly, if I can do the same things that they do, then that seems like you should invest in me. But now it's different. Yeah, now it's different, and also I will say mathematics has been like really humbling. Really, really humbling. I mean, it's so large, and I mean, mathematics in the body of work of humans. Like what the amount of mathematics that's been produced, it's just so big. It's just
Yeah.
so much bigger than anything I've ever learned or ever looked at. It's completely different. It doesn't feel like, I mean, it feels immensely hard to have like a single valuable thought or not even valuable, just like moderately interesting. And then it's also like twofold in that, like there's things about intuition in mathematics that I really enjoyed, like being able to visualize and think about things, and the kind of, yeah. But that doesn't really matter if you don't have like the formal skills at like applying the machinery. And that's been very humbling. I think just the breadth of it. I feel like computer science really, after this couple years of being so interested in mathematics, I think it's really given me the sense that, like, yeah, computer science is really just a child of like mathematics. Like I felt like computer science was like the whole world for me, because I spent so much time with it. And then you pull up to mathematics and you're like, oh, okay, like this is a very, yeah. Anyway, yeah, that's
I want to go more around fundamentals of it. So, I want to learn more about the environment you were in. Were there any more kids you were being growing up with who also been dropping out, or any mentors also? Because it matters a lot what society you're part of, and
yeah,
does the society motivate you to do this stuff? Because
yeah,
it's very humbling experience, to be honest. And there is one thing. I mean, since I mean, pretty much both of us can relate. I mean, we have been growing on internet so far. So what did you actually learn from internet that school probably would not have taught you? There is this broader question here that about whether the internet produces a fundamentally different kind of engineer. one
Yeah.
shaped by obsession, social proof, or rabbit holes rather than curriculum or degrees. Yeah.
Yeah, that's two great questions. I'll try to answer the first one really quickly about like potential mentors or inspirations. I think for programming, when I was a kid, Tom Adams, who's the creator of Dwarf Fortress, back in the day, he was receiving donations, and you could donate some amount of money, and he would draw something, or his brother would draw something, usually both, and they would send it back to you. And I remember donating to them and getting back a little picture of a goblin being killed by like an archer, and I really loved Dwarf Fortress. I thought it was like so complex. I thought it was like the most advanced simulation I could ever imagine. I liked the procedural aspect of it, that it felt infinite and stuff like that. I was just obsessed with it. And so Tan was like the way he spoke about Dwarf Fortress as this like, decades long project of passion where like it's never going to be over. And it's like, this is it, like, there was a clarity to like his life. It looked like he's like, he works on Dwarf Fortress and is going to make it the most fleshed out thing he can. So that was a big inspiration. I never, I exchanged a few emails with him when I was a kid, but never, not a mentor or anything, but definitely an inspiration. In programming, I don't think I've really had any mentors. I had, and I think that's similar to Yassine, Cash on X. We're from a similar cultural background on the internet. In that, it was like soft mentors that weren't named. Everybody was anonymous, but there was this social proof kind of thing that you said, or like this like dynamics of like if you wanted to be able to participate without backlash, you had to be cool to some extent, and to be cool, you had to meet like the metrics that define
Yeah.
cool, and a lot of that was like some niche expertise or something that was impressive to them, and so that like was my culture. I think I wanted to be like I wanted to be cool. I wanted to be able to like say things and not get told to go lurk and go away from the discussion and stuff like that. So that definitely like for me. And then on the job, I had a couple mentors for sure. I had a couple mentors. I mean, the first person who ever gave me a real programming job. I had a couple jobs before. I did some walkthroughs for video games for a famous website when I was a kid. My mom used to be employed by them, and I
Wasn't
would
it
do the
something which drove your curiosity to games
yeah. I think, I mean, I
or
like
jig?
playing games, so it was a way to get paid to play games, which was already very good.
Yeah.
And I like writing, and so writing very like 8 to 15 page walkthroughs of like turn left and then do this, and wasn't too bad for me. And they would send me a game, and I would get to keep it, and they would pay me around $150 per walkthrough, which was massive. And but yeah, so I had a couple like random jobs and a bunch of terrible activities that I did to make money. But then my first real programming job was this guy who I found him, I think, on a forum. I don't quite remember where I found it, but it was some kind of forum in the country I was born in. And he was a previous radio host who was really into video games, and he wanted, this is maybe 2007 or 8 or something. He wanted to make a website with kind of like a live game radio, right? Which at the time that was like somewhat, not really a thing too much. And he wanted to have programs where like, people come in and with interviews and stuff like that. I love video games. I wanted to make, I wanted to program anything I could for money. And so I pitched myself to him on Skype. He, and he knew I was very young and stuff like that, but he gave me a shot, which was very, very nice. And then I built up this thing with him for a while, and I got to go to a couple game conferences. That was huge for me. I met a couple like actors from Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. Like that was crazy. I was very young, and I thought like it was like a being uplifted, by something. So I was very thankful. But maybe I'll cut it short. There's a couple mentors in the rest of my career. It's
Yeah.
been 15 years, so there's been some time. But there's a couple, a CTO or two that were like very important to my way of thinking. But yeah, to go back to the second part, can you remind me the second part just in case so I don't stray?
Yeah, I mean, growing up on the internet and internet producing a different kind of engineer, being shaped of obsession, social proof, and going into rabbit holes than curriculum or degrees, which is normal education is about.
I mean, I think that's completely a thing. I think that's entirely a thing. I think that there are like microcultures that get bred in these digital spaces that are very hard to that would not be found in the real world, mostly because like the kind of like interactions and the stakes are completely different. And so in the kind of like main boards like G, and then the sub communities that grow around that in the old fortune times, I mean, you can be hyper competitive and incredibly rude to anything that's like even slightly off your your sense of taste, or however you want to define that someone is good. And you can have these like just very aggressive extremely competitive spaces, and then you have all this kind of like language that gets born of like the kind of way that people speak about things, all the made up words that even pop up. 4chan produced a plethora of like language that's now like normal internet language. And so I think that that definitely affected like the generation of engineers that like popped up on these. I think now it's very different. I think now it's very different. I think Discord and just the nature of kind of like the spirit of the internet has changed quite a bit. I don't think it's I don't think it's for the worse or anything. I just think that people are different. But I mean, I was pleasantly surprised because I really did not know before joining X like a couple years ago to find out all these incredibly talented kids. We certainly felt like way more talented than the kids that were around my time. We weren't. I don't feel like we were that good. And meeting the I don't know if I can name a few, can cut it out, but HSV Sphere and Snowy, a
Yeah.
couple of them. I got to spend time with them in real life, and some quite a bit, for weeks or months. And clearly they come from an internet culture also. It's not my culture, it's a different culture. There are some tenets that are still shared, but it's a different culture. Cello is a great example. He was a lovely kid, and he's very talented, very smart, and he grew up on the internet just like me, in isolation on the internet, with like almost like a double life. You have like your real life,
Yeah.
and then you have like this long periods alone on your computer with very little like parental control or anything like that. And it's super interesting because in a way he's very different than me, and he had different influences, but it still produced someone that like is very unlike the kind of cookie cutter, like let's say you're 18, you're thinking about like careers, like what's a good thing to do, blah, blah, okay, computer science, programming, I have a cousin who does this, you know what I mean, like that's produces a different kind of person, I think. Not objectively better or anything, by the way, even at engineering itself, but yeah.
Since you're talking about culture, how do you like the culture in San Francisco?
Yeah, I'm not a fan. Yeah, I'm not a fan. I mean, I think San Francisco is not exactly what it is on the internet. It's like more complex in real life, and there are lots of wonderful people in San Francisco. You just don't see them being very loud on X. Like, but I've met a lot of interesting people there. But the overall, like the culture that you see from the outside looking in, like the one that they project, especially over the last few years, but it's always been disgusting. And it's I mean, it's an effective culture. Or it's an effective culture because if the goal is to grow as an organism that attracts like the kind of things that you want for the organism, then this, both ends of the spectrum of the SF culture, which is, let's say, the ASI soon, solve math, solve super intelligence or whatever, and then the AI doomers kind of side. Both sides aren't necessary. They're perfect. They hit both extremes, and they permeate through people's minds like super effectively. They're packaged like very tightly. I think it's disgusting in general because like the mixture of like the high focus on entrepreneurship and the, like kind of like the value system that they portray, the value system and the metrics they choose to optimize for young people. I think it's like fucking terrifying. I think it's very terrifying, and there's a real sense of like missing out if you're not fucking playing the game that they lay out in front of you. And that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, and nobody's really telling them that there's like much out there, or even questioning like what are we even discussing, when it's like ASI soon, and like there won't be any white collar jobs in 2 years or whatever. Like, what does that even mean? Like, what does
Sure.
that mean? And yeah, so the SF culture in general, pretty gross. I also, by the way, when I go to SF, I think it's fascinating because usually I go and I'm like kind of paraded around like a zoo animal, and so I meet different people, and there's a lot of lovely people who like invite me over, and that's nice. And yeah, but most of the time I'm paraded around like a circus freak, and I talk to these people, and a lot of them, they ask me like, so what are you doing? Like, what's your, what's the, yeah. And I tell them what I'm doing, and they most of the time I find them to be at least confused and sometimes even disappointed. They're disappointed that I'm not, that I like, why don't I just spin this off and accept this, like, this money from these people, and then like, maybe this could be like, 18 million, little starter, and then we can turn this into a company. And why don't I want to build a company? Like, what, this is a question that comes
Yeah.
up all the time.
Yep.
And it's like, it's very hard to tell them that, well, first, for most of these people, I don't think they're very good at what they do. I think that the game is like kind of like so silly, it's like theatrical. It's like, I think I could do anything that they do, and I don't think they could do anything that I do. So it's very like, it's like, of course I can do this. Like, I mean, yeah, I can come to your playground and play, the game, and I would do fine. But I'm not interested in your playground at all. I have a perfectly fine time, exploring my interest. And this is easy to say when you have some money. I will say this is not, this is not to look down on people who have to play the game. I had to play the game too. But yeah, SF culture is strange. I think it's interesting that they're so either disgusted or confused or disappointed in me. People that seem to like me, once they learn what I do or what I spend my time doing, they're like, oh well, but that doesn't make, I don't understand. That doesn't make money. Like that's not like a thing that, like, where are the numbers going out? And it's like, oh, I just don't have any interest in that. And also the difference between them and me is that I don't feel like there's any pressure for me because I know that I can turn it on whenever I want. In 3 years or 4 years, I can step in and I will just, it doesn't matter much to me how the world changes. I think I'll be able to like navigate it and just, do it then if I need to. So yeah.
Interesting. Makes sense. Also, so going back to the self-taught thing. So, I mean, this is one thing I think about a lot. So, AI can now explain almost anything instantly. So, does that make being self-taught easier, or does it actually make it harder because people get trapped in infinite explanations without ever doing the reps?
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, both. Like, first of all, both. It definitely does make it easier, and it does trap people. And it's also important to define like what does it mean to explain something, and then what are the kind of like artifacts you get from it. Like, what do you get when an LLM explains something? I think that there's a lot of like the self-learning you can do with LLMs. Sometimes it's borderline on like the kind of thing that you do when you watch Three Blue One Brown. Wonderful creator and like super cool videos. But in 25 minutes you don't learn anything. I mean, there's no there's nothing for free. I mean, there must be some pain. There must be some work. Even if it is putting in reps, there must be some work. And so what you get with Ruby One Brown is if you've done some work before, then maybe it helps you visualize. It helps you rethink something completely. It puts it into words maybe. And I think LLMs, like, from scratch, I don't know anybody who's been learning like programming completely from scratch at the moment. I'm really curious what it looks like. But I would say it's like super dependent on the personality of the person and how lucky they are that like they've had the people around them to tell them like what it means to learn. Because otherwise, if you don't know, then I mean, you might feel like you're learning, but I don't know what. And then does it matter? By the way, another thing is, does it matter that you're learning if you can do the thing? If the agents do it for you, then what does it matter? And it depends. Also, like it really depends. A lot of the things you don't need to learn. You don't need to understand at all. You need to know how to use them, or you need to get them to the people that need them, that are going to pay you for it. And in that way, that's not too dissimilar to how I learned programming at the beginning, by the way, which is that I wasn't that interested in programming. I mean, I was very interested in programming because it was cool to be able to like dictate what a machine would do. I loved computers and all that stuff, but the actual internals of what it means to program and like the kind of like theory under it, I had no interest in it. And I think I kind of learned a little bit like people are learning with agents now, where like they just like do things until it works, kind of, and like maybe they PR out the code. And like certainly I wasn't like decomposing what is it that I've written logically and like figuring out what is it that I actually did. It's just like, does it pass the test, or does it compile? Is it the expected value? But yeah, to go back to your question, I think it's super tough. I think that like you have to have some sense of why is it that you do things at all, and then you must accept that there's probably many answers at different levels of abstraction. And if the goal is like get into the industry quick and make some money, then it doesn't really matter as long as it's effective. Whatever is the just spam LLMs, do whatever, like it doesn't. Yeah, if you're deeply interested, then I think you're probably more likely to have a sense that, oh, okay, like this is giving me a nice little explanation. I understand it, but I don't understand. I don't know what that means actually. Like, I mean, I know what it means, but it's like it's not. I can't use it in any way. Like I wouldn't be able to use it. And so that's useful if you're maximizing for like kind of like your understanding of the world or the things you're learning. I certainly use LLMs for learning, very often, in many ways. I use it for mathematics. I use it for programming. I use agents also for a lot of code generation and various things like automations and things like that. But for learning mathematics, for example, it's the latest models are so good, even at like pretty advanced mathematics. But that's kind of like what I was saying about the difference between being able to visualize something and explain it at a high level and like having the formal like capacity to use the tools. And that's something that LLMs, like, I mean, they can help generating exercise sheets or whatever, but basically like it's up to your personality to keep you in check and tell you like, well, yeah, if I don't just grind exercises, then maybe I know this, but I know this in a very superficial way.
Yep. I do think it will be just getting easier and easier only. I mean, again, it comes down to the one's taste and how they are approaching it. But I think the future is going to be awesome.
I
Anyways, yeah. So you have been, so I mean, you have worked in lots of work culture companies, and since you're working, you have been worked as principal engineer, so you have been seeing company culture a lot. So there's this question. So I found that you have written about finding the wizards inside a company,
Yeah.
basically the 20% of people doing 80% of what actually matters. So what are the signs someone is a wizard, I mean, according to your experience? And what would you tell someone joining a company where they feel maybe massively underskilled compared to the people around them? And how much this company culture matters when someone is joining a company? I mean, it can be at any stage of the career, early stage, or maybe after some year of experiences, or yeah, just I mean, would love to know your experience here.
Yeah. It's a lot of good questions. So for finding wizards, I mean, again, depends for what you're optimizing for. For me, when I come into a company, even when I was, well, let's say there was two stages to my life. The first one was when I needed to be safe as fast as possible. I feel like I barely got in, and people are better than me, and it's like, how am I going to produce any value at all? Like, oh my god, like I forgot how to program. Like I have no idea what to do, and so you want to, at least for me, I mimicked from the best. I just observed what they did, the way they spoke, the way they explained themselves, their code, any kind of history about them, any kind of previous messages or previous pull requests, anything that I could read about the way they did things was important. Any meeting with them where they get to speak to someone else and I get to observe was like super important because I could like basically fashion myself after them to some extent. I could take the best traits, and then once I get my footing, I also have my own positive traits. And so I could just, I felt like I was kind of like stealing the best parts of everybody. And then once everything clicks for me, I also brought my parts, which nobody else had. And so that it always worked out very well for me, I think. As to how to find them specifically, I think that's like super, you know, subjective maybe. But you have a sense of like in companies, there's a lot of inefficiencies. And there is, some kind of Pareto distribution of what is meaningful work being done and by who. And if you're very, very young, it's probably very hard to find. I'm sure I wasn't, especially in larger teams and companies. But if you've been programming for a little bit and you have, I mean, I don't know. For me, at least, it wasn't. I had a sense of like, okay, this guy speaks a lot, doesn't do that much, or I can tell the meaningful things that are being done by this person every week is it's just not. That's not what he's saying, and so I can like suss it out. Versus the people who like do very what I think are very important things and maybe are not even in the kind of like perceived hierarchy as important. So that I think is like some kind of taste, in like that's how I found them. In my last job, certainly I found like a couple of them, and the way I did it is you could kind of feel like even when they spoke in the Slack channel, like they had been like you could see like 11 years, like they joined 11 years ago, 13 years ago. You don't see
Yeah.
them often. Usually you see them on critical things, like there's a huge activity spike, and then a bunch of our like bare metal servers are falling apart, and they jump in then, and that's not even their team. It's like oh, you just know that historically because you've been there. You actually built that 7 years ago. That kind of stuff, like that was I was like, okay, there's like 6 or 7 guys here. They all seem, they have different personalities. Some of them are more approachable than others, and I was like, okay, like I gotta navigate to them. And actually, after a few years, I ended up working with all of them, and many of them were in my team, which is nice. That was cool. I'm still very happy about that. And to go on with your other questions, one of the things you mentioned is like how much does company culture matter?
Yeah.
I mean, it matters immensely. It matters immensely. It's also very hard to change a company culture. That's something that I learned on my last job. I tried a tremendous amount to shift the culture, and I think in pockets like I did because I kind of basically built a subculture. And so for my teams, the culture was different. It was much more maybe a little less amicable and a bit more like rough and a bit more aggressive, but in a good way. We were like really bonded with each other. But yeah, culture does matter. It matters for a few things. If you're trying to climb up and just like secure yourself a position, make some money and things like that, then you got to be able to read it in the first place. If it's all teddy bears and like everybody's like super soft and there's this like theater at every stand up and stuff like that. I mean, you have kind of like inefficiencies you can abuse. It's like, well, just do more work than them. Then you can lie even you have to lie even less than them. You can just straight up say what you said. You're flexing on them all, which is good. And so yeah, it does matter for both your progress. I think like like just navigating that space and also emotionally. I think it does matter. Yeah, there are some cultures that just suck. There are some cultures that don't match with you, and the younger you are, the harder that advice is. But I think later in a career, maybe after a couple of years, 4 or 5 years, it's important if you can to grab territory. You want to make your own culture. It's very unlikely you join the perfect teddy bear place, and everything just clicks perfectly, even if it does like directionally. And you're in a great company, like let's say PlanetScale, wonderful company, a lot of cool guys, Cloudflare, mostly I think a great company with a lot of very competitive guys. It's like you probably want your own slice of the pie, and you want to be able to like tune things so that you can do what you're supposed to do the best possible. And the way to do that is to accumulate as many resources, both social and perceived and intangible, like deliverables, that you can trade them in. You can make larger moves. Um, yeah, it's a bit of a game theoretical approach, I think, to like how to navigate companies. It sounds. I remember one very mean comment that made me very sad when I first wrote this. That somebody said that it sounded sociopathic, and I was very hurt by that. I didn't understand, because I thought, well, like it's not like I'm hurting anybody. I don't mean to. I'm not abusing anyone. But yeah, somebody said it sounded very sociopathic, and now every time I say it, I catch myself being like, okay, well, that's like a little weird, I guess, but it is effective, and to some extent, everybody is playing their own game like that, even if it's like maximizing how hidden they are so that they can pretend on the minimal amount of work to you know what I mean. Everybody's playing their own game. It's completely fair to play your game optimally, I think.
This is super relatable. Let's dive more into the core of the podcast. For information, I have titled the podcast as a quest to formalize intelligence, and I mean, so I will just start from scratch, since you have been working on understanding.
Yeah.
So the first question here is, how do you define understanding?
Well, I don't want to be deflectionary and or relativist or anything like that, so I'll give concrete answers, but it's going to be sprawling. You're going to have to forgive me. It's end of the day, and I will hit a bunch of points. Hopefully, something comes out. There are many ways. First of all, understanding is a very thick concept. It's not. It's not something you can cleanly look at. It's not a thing in itself. It's a composition of other things that ascribe to some system that you're observing, and you say that you put that label on it. I think there are some ways to there are some kind of games and thoughts you can go through, like, let's say Magnus Carlsen versus which we could say as humans, like, that he understands chess, and we should describe what that means for us. We can do that after, but what does it mean that he understands chess? But certainly, I think most people would agree, Magnus Carlsen understands chess. He's very strong at chess, and he has incredible intuition and incredible computational capacities, in end games and stuff like that. And then, let's say he's playing against one of the latest, models, AI models for chess, and obviously he's going to lose the overwhelming majority of the time. Maybe he's going to draw a couple games, and is it possible to beat Magnus Carlsen without understanding some aspects of chess? I mean, well, probably not. I mean, that's probably a thing that we it would be hard to argue that you don't need to understand it at all in some way. Maybe not in many ways, but in some way. You have to understand it to some extent. The way that these models understand it is well, I mean, they've probably trained over playing many chess games. They probably have some search components, to some extent, and in the training process, they compressed a tremendous amount of information. And when you have so many things to store, and you can't just memorize them because you don't have enough space to just straight up build a lookup table of every single 10 to the 20, 10 to the 120, state space of chess, and just write, if he does that move, then play that move. You can't just memorize. As a matter of fact, you wouldn't have enough space in the whole universe. If you can't do that, then you have to compress. To compress effectively, you want to find some patterns. You want to find some structures, things that repeat. You want to be able to find first primitive patterns and recurrences, and then you want to, because you're still constrained in space, you want to abstract the abstractions, to some extent. You want to find larger abstractions that are more potent, that have more load-bearing structure on the data you're compressing. And one of the goals for that is in the case of compression, is compression is equivalent to prediction. I think that's fair to say. And I think in that process, it would be really hard to argue that they don't understand anything. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that they understand like humans. I would also say that it's not very clear what it means when a human understands anything. And it's probably not too dissimilar to what happens when we start understanding things. We have a tremendous amount of inputs that are coming in. We're compressing them in some ways, and in very complex, nested, kind of substrates that kind of do polycomputing, where they compute many different things at once at different scales. So if you zoom in to the chemical reactions and and zoom back up all the way, it's a very complex system. But still, input comes in. Over time, we have some feedbacks. We know what the state should be to some extent, so we can correct it. And that, like, if you lose the game, then obviously you've done something wrong. And yeah, and we do that, plus the fact that obviously Magnus Carlsen, for example, didn't grow up in a lab. I think, who knows, but I think he's a real person, and he walked around and he had a lot of other things that fleshed him out as a person. There was a lot of signals, I think, from early childhood with the kind of parenting he got, the kind of inputs he got there, that wired and primed him to some extent. There was also probably a nature component of, like, the very size of his systems, I think. But at the end of the day, he played a lot of chess. He's developed some things we call intuitions, some things that, like, basically collapse, like, the search space. Like, fundamentally, what Carlsen and many other super grandmasters and grandmasters, just good chess players in general, what they do is they collapse a very, very, very large state space into kind of like learned heuristics. Like, they have these, like, kind of like priors that they're able to use, and they still do computation. Carlsen obviously does many computations, even in endgames. He's able to. Endgames are simpler in that a human could compute, large portions of the endgame after you've pruned the obvious, like, nonsensical moves. But yeah, what the intuitions he's learned, I think, are, like, basically these kind of, like, yeah, maybe these priors over the state space that allows it to collapse, and so you have much less to search. Sometimes you don't even have to search; it's just almost like a lookup. You just have. And the beauty of them is that they generalize. They generalize to out of distribution things that have not been seen before, which is a great statement to how effective the compression and the predictive model is. So I don't think that explains or answers what is understanding, but it's
I mean,
also, I don't think it's observable.
it's
Yeah,
much great. I mean, it is. I mean, the analogy is really great, and it tells a lot about what understanding actually revolves around. So, I mean, continuing over the same fact, in your math versus programming essay, you argue that pure mathematics is the only domain with truly precise semantics. Let me make it more clear, because mathematical objects are not made of electrons, quarks, or
yeah.
cells. They exist in a space that's uncorrupted by physical implementation. So does that mean understanding is fundamentally about operating in a space like that?
That's a great question. I'll first, just flesh out maybe a little of what I meant by this. I mean, the context was somebody was asking me about, like, the relationship between syntax and semantics and programming and mathematics and things like that. And a big thing that I was trying to carry in that answer is that we are, these organisms, we are observers of this, physical reality through some limited sensors, and we are certainly, like, incredibly limited, although we have incredible, like, explanatory punching power, much further than we are. We're able to predict planetary movements and accurately predict the weather and implement incredible medication and stuff like that. So I mean, we're pretty crazy cool, but we're still, like, incredibly limited. And so certainly precise semantics, like, at the physical level, is like, I mean, it depends on where you want to stop, basically. And then you can kind of, like, say, like, okay, well, like, down to this level we will say this is precise semantics. In reality, it just happens that being approximately correct to a very, very large degree of, like, accuracy is good enough for the physical world. And then that's mostly how everything works around us, including the computers we're talking on and the error correction that's going on through the networks, and how our planes are flying around. It's nothing is so precise that we fully understand everything that's going on. We don't need to, and so that's okay. And about it, and so I guess the point, by the way, is that, like, in a made up formal system, I'm not saying pure mathematics is made up. I'm just saying, like, if you make up a formal system, you can have very, very precise semantics, fully precise semantics. In everything else, I mean, we're choosing to call it as such because we're not willing to, like, zoom in all the way, and that's okay. But can you remind me of your question again? Sorry, I got sidetracked on. Yeah.
I mean, so this understanding is fundamentally operating in the space of, like, how pure mathematics is around. Like, it is not made up of electrons, quark, or cell. It exists in a space that is very uncorrupted by physical implementation.
I don't think so. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I'm very much a physicalist in that sense. I mean, I don't think that there is. I think that it feels a certain way, and that and certainly because you cannot just freeze time and zoom in on a brain and point to, here is the understanding moment. Then it doesn't. It's because it's a virtual property of the underlying physical system. It's not. I think Joshua Bach has a great kind of explanation for that, or like an example for that, where he mentions, like, okay, you have your computer running Minecraft, it's running Minecraft, you're playing Minecraft, you zoom in, freeze time, and you zoom into your GPU and you look at the patterns of electrons on the GPU, and you don't see Minecraft. I mean, Minecraft is not there. Like there's not, it's just a bunch of things, doing things. But certainly Minecraft is not there. Minecraft is an emergent phenomenon from the physical computations that are being done, right? I think, my point is I'm not too keen on believing that like humans have like a certain like non-physical access to something where like some things don't live in physical space. I think that like it just so happens that physical space is so complex that it can sustain things like that, like as complex as understanding, which is a very like insanely strange and nuanced human concept. Like understanding is not really a thing on its own. It's just really like it's a thing that we have to come up with like what it means to understand, because it's like yeah, but it's not, I don't think it's magical either. I think at the end of the day, it's very much the emergence of very complex mechanical processes, and it follows physical laws and things like that. Yeah.
Totally makes sense. And with this advent of LLMs, there has been this growing question, and I've been seeing your tweets as well, about the difference between understanding and knowing. So, I mean, questions come like, am I intelligent? Are my cells intelligent? Is an LLM intelligent? So, after all the reading and research, so I mean, are you at a point like where you have an answer, or has the question gotten harder only?
I mean, I think I don't know if I have answer. I definitely have like preferences. Yeah, for sure. I think I've started fleshing out the answer. The difference between understanding and knowing. I mean, maybe I'll try to give a short answer, and then if we want, we can like talk about like kind of like epistemology kind of stuff, But I mean, first of all, the distinction for LLMs. I mean, there are certain things that they simply do not know, because it's something that they've not seen before, and they're still able to do it. So it's certainly not is it is not just like it's not just like memorization. That's for sure. Does that imply understanding? Well, as we discussed with understanding, it's like depends on what we mean, I guess. But it would be hard to argue that there's no understanding at all of any form, and but it would also be hard to argue that like they truly understand. I mean, like humans do. I mean, it's just not the same thing, and that's okay. So if I take a more like personable approach and I don't get caught up in philosophical camps and stuff like that, and I just speak for myself, what I would say about the for the kids that I talk to on X, for example, when I've talked about that with them for sure. Between knowing and understanding is like understanding for me is generative. I mean, it's generative, and it's explanatory in breadth, and it's we would to talk about what explanatory means for us and like what we define as that. But like for me, there's a lot of things that I know. I know a bunch of dates and capitals, and there are things that I know. There are things I think I know, which are kind of facts that fall out of certain like theorems or physical laws or stuff like that. That's not quite the same as knowing the first kind. I mean, it's not quite the same. And then understanding is a much more personal process, I guess. Understanding is a much more personal process, and it's something that has much more to do with your model of the thing. It's your internal model and your internal way that you have to navigate new things that come up that could touch that model, and how that model reacts. And is it broad enough that if like really new things come up, your model still fits and is still capable of like at least giving some crumbs of explanation, or is it like really faulty and things like that. So my that would be the difference that I give between knowing and understanding. Yeah, I'm sorry this is a little tentative, because I'm trying to. It would be good if I didn't just get caught up in all the different caught up on what things mean and the different like schools of thoughts around that and stuff like that. And I gave you, so that is my answer. That would be my difference in my day to day. Yeah.
Makes sense. And I mean, yeah, understanding. I mean, this is pretty much very fundamental to when someone kind of start. Even reading experience could be understanding if they just go into the thoughts of it and how the author is trying to make a thought around. And I think yeah, there are very subjective opinions around.
Yeah.
The next subsection I want to highlight on basically. So your writing and thinking is deeply inspired by Michael Levin's work. For people who have not come across him, so how do you describe Michael Levin, and what made his work grab your attention?
Well, that's a great question. I like Michael Levin because he's similar to other thinkers I like, in that he is very he seems to come at things from a fresh eye, and he also has interest in other fields. I think he's broad enough. I always enjoyed people like Scott Aronson, who's like computer scientist by trade, kind of quantum computing and stuff like that, but as like a very broad world model where like he's able to pull from different things and weave them together. I always find that it makes for like people that I really want to talk with, and I'm always interested in. So Michael Levin, I mean, I heard of him a couple times, like, passingly. And then last year at this conference, this friend from X, who I became quite close with, we were at this conference in Systems Distributed in Amsterdam. And this was, we hung out after the conference, and he was telling me, we were in a spa, I think. And he was telling me, I was telling him about a bunch of people. I was telling him about Princeton, with active inference and stuff like that, and David Dutch and a bunch of others. He was like, well, you gotta tap into to Michael Levin and what he's doing. He was telling me about some of his work with like bioelectricity and xenobots and anthrobots and things like that. And we can quickly describe them after. But he was telling me all about that stuff, and I was like, okay, this is kind of neat. And then I found out he had a YouTube channel where he has these lectures, like this kind of like many lectures. Started looking into some of his papers, and I was like, whoa, this is kind of like this is interesting. It's like, first of all, as a computer scientist, there are some of his things that I like because it's like I can understand them. They're not so woven in deep biology, and I so quickly jumping out like, things about like, decentralized versus centralized systems and like, things like that being like, just understandable from my own experience. So that was neat. But then the thing that really hooked me on Michael Levin, I think, is just the novelty of his approach, because he reframes a lot of things in a very like, teleological way. He interprets cells, for example, as agents navigating some kind of problem space. He has this concept of like a cognitive light cone, for example, which is like the spatial temporal boundaries of how far along can you plan, for your goal, right? And so if you're like maybe like gap junctions, which are little openings for voltages to pass through, that's maybe like nanometers and very short amount of time. Whereas like for me, I have some plans that are in decades. I have a very, very large light cone, and it's this kind of like matryoshka doll, in that there's this stacking of different computational models, a lot of them using the same substrate to compute at different scales. And so I liked that because it looked like he was getting like empirical results, like real things. He was figuring out things. And the only thing he did is like basically, instead of looking at it like his field would have, he looked at it from how a different field would have looked at it. And I thought that was already very interesting. Then later on, I started hearing from him a couple of things about the Platonic space, things about mathematics. And I was like, well, that's very neat. I'm interested in, what are the kind of like latent philosophical claims he's not telling me, like what does he really think at night, like when he's not recording on YouTube. And one of the ideas that really I thought was very powerful, with very little regard for if it's true or not, I think for me, I don't mind if it's not true. It doesn't, I'm not very attached to it. I just think it's a very interesting idea, is that there is this, and this is a bit related to Whitehead and things like that, but the idea that like physical systems can be assembled in such a way that they summon behaviors, that there's this space of patterns and behaviors somewhere, and that if you assemble a system a certain way, you get some of these behaviors for free. You don't have to mechanically build it like a clock, which would be like, this a very mechanical thing, or maybe a thermostat, which is a little less mechanical. I mean, it's somewhat of a magical thing already in that it reacts. You build it in such a way that it does things, it follows the temperature. But, this idea that there's this space of patterns or behaviors, and that you could potentially learn about the things, about how to build physical systems to ingress whichever patterns or behaviors you want, I think is very neat. And I think the reason why it comes so well with me was, I spent some time with like, Wolfram and Cellular Automata and Emergence and, things like that. And so that was all like, and then obviously over the last 2-3 years with LLMs, I'd spent a bunch of time with intelligence and things like that. So it was like kind of like a perfect little, like, bundling of a bunch of stuff I liked. And there's something that I think we both agree on, is that like, I had this post, and I think Levin has said it in other ways, or maybe, it's very similar ways, is like, if you keep asking why, again and again and again, you end up in the mathematics department, right? Like, I think that's like a very poignant thing. And there are things that you could change about there's some kind of causality in that, like, there are things you could change in the physical world that would not change mathematics. But there are things you could change in mathematics, like that if they were any different, would change things in the physical world. And so that's, if you're interested in patterns and like, real patterns, and you're interested in why things are the way they are at all, and you have an interest in mathematics, and you have an interest in, how does cognition emerge and things like that. I mean, Michael Levin seems to encompass like a very, very interesting research program. And so that's how I got into it. And I don't know maybe we can follow it up after, but the kind of first steps we took to kind of see if we could play the game. Let me know if if
I
you
mean,
want to hear
yeah,
that.
that's very interesting. I mean, the next thing I'm coming up to, so you started a research lab based on his ideas. I mean, what's the lab about? And for people who have not heard of it, can you explain what a xenobot is and why its existence breaks our usual assumption about where behavior comes from?
Yeah. So yeah, we started a lab in November last year, when my friend was over, and we did Thanksgiving together, and then Christmas, and we were chatting a lot. And at the time, I was really into shift theory. I was really, really into shift theory, and it happens that he knew this mathematician guy who had written a couple books on shift theory, actually, and a very interesting person. And we thought, okay, let's have a workshop on shift theory. Let's talk about sheaves. And he came from it from a very applied angle, and I came from this super. I was getting into I was taking a journey for the last year with Grothendieck and stuff. So I came from a very abstract world, and we were discussing all these things. And one thing that came up all the time was Michael Levin. Michael Levin came kept popping up. And one of the papers specifically that came up is I think it's called Sorting Algorithms as a Model of Morphogenesis. And it's a paper that you can go. I think he has an article on Forbes now, and there's certainly many videos from him on this. He mentioned it in the couple podcasts and stuff like that. But it was an interesting paper because for me, I was starting to see some of the what I thought was some of the issues with his approach, in that there was a bit of a kind of a semantic stretch that he was doing, because in this paper he basically says, well, we've implemented this specific sorting algorithms in such a way that they're decentralized, and we're observing these properties which are not in the code at all. And one of the first things, I'm a computer person, so first thing I did is look at the code, and I was like, well, that's not bubble sort. I mean, you have to change it to make it in such a way that that it is decentralized. And so I'm not so sure that there are no mechanistic interpretation, for why would you see that phenomenon. And so we discussed that for a bit. And my friend told me that, well, you should go and figure it out, go see if there's a mechanistic interpretation. And then I went and I did that, and we found mechanistic interpretation for one of the phenomena, and the other one is still very interesting. But from there I thought, okay, well, oh shit, Michael Levin was it's very, when you meet a powerful new thinker, and they kind of come into your mind, it's they're untouchable for a bit, I think, and then you spend enough time with them and you're like, oh well, actually I think that's wrong, and I'm pretty sure this shows mechanistically this is not what's happening. And so that kind of emboldened me, and we spent some time discussing okay, well, what would we do to to extend that program to kind of in our own limited ways, we don't have in vivo labs, and we can't take frog cells and put them on little plates, and we don't have things to mess with the bioelectricity of cells or anything like that. But what could we do to figure out and extend some of his research, and also maybe parallelize the work to some extent. A lot of what he does is he kind of has this intervention based protocol, I guess, where he takes something that you kind of blanket as an agent, or many agents, and you kind of mess with them. You mess with them and you see how they react. Maybe you have something going from A to B, and you put a little wall in the middle, and you see well, does it circumvent the wall? And if so, is it kind of following a stupid energy gradient, or is it capable to take novel paths and stuff like that? And so we started thinking of many kind of experiments where we could just see that. And then because I was so enamored with this penchant for Platonic, Platonism, and stuff like that, I was wondering is there a way that we could extract recurrent structures of any sort between these things? Are there things that will pop up in very different in let's say ODEs and PDEs, discrete cellular automata, continuous cellular automata, search algorithms, sort algorithms, and sub-body physics. Is there things that will pop up that have enough structure that we could say, well, these are these are very different substrates, and yet these are shared. They pop up in both, and so that's how it started. Yeah.
Amazing. Also, it also extended to some sort of proof hash research and active inference. So your current research maps concepts from Levin's biology onto mathematical proof space. So swapping morphospace with proof space, cellular collectives with MCTS search, bioelectric patterns with tactic sequences. I'm just curious to understand the objective here and what you're trying to. Just want to understand the alignment thinking in this direction.
Yeah. So there are two very simple ways to understand it. The first one is, this is the most simple one, is what if we did what he did with sorting algorithms on a different kind of algorithm? And then we thought, like, what have I been doing lately? And it happened that I was doing some like lean formalization work. And so that was the first thing. Now, the second thing is I thought it would be interesting to have a very simple Monte Carlo tree search, like the exact same one as like, AlphaGo used, simple search algorithm that, given a lean statement, which has a goal, which you can subdivide by applying tactics, which are like some transformations. I thought like, okay, well, we just search and then a move provider, like a thing that tells you at each state of the statement as you transform it, what are the moves you can play, which are the tactics, which in this case are basically like small LLMs like Dixie Prover, which are fine-tuned to only emit given a lean statement and the state of the proof, also all the goals and sub goals, to return only a list of tactics, let's say 10 tactics. And I was thinking, okay, with a bunch of different providers, so that we don't only look at the biases that our tactics provider give us, let's take a bunch of models and maybe let's build a heuristic one, which we did. So like our own handcrafted one. So if the goal looks like this, then suggest these tactics. We just search, what do these graphs look like? First of all, like what if you put it on a graph and you have the nodes as the state of the proof. So what are the goals? And then you subdivide them into sub goals. You have two nodes, and the edges are the tactics. What does this graph look like? Are they interesting on their own? Do you have any, And then what happens if we block some tactics from being applied? What happens if we block some tactics or entire families of tactics? What happens if we mess with the algorithm in some ways that it doesn't expect that it could be messed with? There are some assumptions where, like, I don't know, you could kill backpropagation on MCTS, for a bit, or feed, there's lots of different ways you can intervene. And then what happens to the graphs then? So you have this comparison point between the baseline and the altered, the post-intervention graphs. And then there's a bunch of like, little, like simple graph theory stuff you can do with like, how the edit distance between graphs and things like that. But what we saw was interesting. I mean, I don't want to expand too much on it. I mean, we're going to present it pretty soon. So yeah, but I will say we saw some interesting things. There are really three modes that tend to happen when you block these tactics. The graph might reroute. So you might find a kind of like a different basin of attraction and still prove the mathematical statement. It might collapse entirely. So it's somehow like the tactics you blocked were load bearing in some way. It's important that it's in the context of like this specific MCTS budget and these specific tactic providers. This is not like a universal claim on proof search. It's really precise in this environment and another state. But anyway, the goal there was a couple things. One, we wanted to see like, could I operationalize millions of different lean statements that we scrapped from a bunch of benchmarks and things, build a harness that runs MCTS in a distributed way, make use of the little compute that we have to do this, capture all the data, and then try my hand at kind of like topological data analysis and just normal data analysis and you see if there's anything we can do, and to show that there could be maybe protocognitive, that's what Michael Levin would call them, signs in even this search algorithm, in that it has some goal-orientedness, it has some capacity of adaptation and things like that. So that's what the paper is about.
Amazing. I want to understand active inference a bit more. So it has been proposed as a framework for building better AI systems, and you are at the intersection of understanding Levin's biology, for instance, free energy principle, and hands-on machine learning engineering. So from that vantage point, is active inference actively useful for building things, or is it more useful as a lens for understanding things?
That's a great question. It's also funny because if you asked me that in the last 6 months and then 12 months ago and 18 months ago, I think my answers would have been very different. But I mean, maybe at a super high level, to not like get bogged down, but like, active inference as a concept is what's a good way to succinctly explain it. You have an agent, and you have an environment. You have something that's called the Markov blanket, which is not very important, but there's a clear separation between the agent and the environment. You can draw a nice boundary between what is the agent and the environment. And then the agent, has some sensors to perceive its environment. And the active inference is basically something about, the predictive model or models that this agent would be running about the environment, and its attempt to minimize error over time, to improve the predictive models. And there's two ways to do that. One of them is to simply you expect the frog is going to jump off the rock and it doesn't jump off the rock, and then so you just update your priors and you're like, okay, well, not all frogs jump off rocks, that's, you've minimized the error a little bit. Or to take an action in the world, right? To physically take an action into the environment to make it more like your predictive model. And so without going into like, variational free energy and stuff like that, like, this is basically the gist of it. And is it useful? I think, first of all, I think it's a fascinating concept because it feels, this is kind of like the Bayesian brain hypothesis kind of camp, and stuff like that. I think there is a very, if you were in the world of like compression prediction and predictive models and stuff like that, I mean, there's something very visceral about it. I think it feels like, okay, well, that actually is a very, very nice model of how things might work, I also think it's a kind of model that you can kind of like paint on anything to some extent, and so that is a drawback of it, in that you could interpret a lot of stuff as that. And there is a difference between, we model this thing using this kind of machinery and this thing is doing this, like, I mean, those are not the same thing. Although I would lean towards, we're closer to like active inference as us than we're not. I just think it's obviously like it's a very nice workable, computable model, and it's not exactly what is happening, but it's like directionally accurate to me. Is it useful for AI? I think was the second part of your question. And I mean, yes and no. I think yes. At the moment, I'm not super familiar with very large, like, I don't think the people who have many resources are spending a lot of time with like very esoteric or like, kind of more like very long shot theoretical things. But there are many, there are papers around on ML and active inference. There are papers on ML and category theory. There's a bunch of things around, but I think like the effort right now is like shifted like very much engineering wise. Even though it's like the age of research, as Elon said and stuff, like, I mean, there's still like a tremendous amount of power and money to be made at the moment. And so for individuals who might be interested, I think there is a lot of interesting things that you could do. And there is a plethora of people who've done that at small scales all over archive. But I would say maybe the most interesting thing about it is, for people who don't know it, is to simply spend maybe, I mean, Freeston has maybe a couple of videos of an hour or two that you could watch. You could also read maybe the first few chapters of, for instance, book. I think it's palatable enough. Maybe a little repetitive. Maybe it's not the most efficient, but just to get you, especially if you're not like into like the Bayesian kind of world, I think it's a brilliant model to be aware of, because it really will expand your way of looking at things. And I think that could be useful in more realistic research you might be doing.
Very true. Makes sense. Let's dive more into how you have been working around distributed systems. So you have been building event-driven distributed systems for product research and runtime experimentation at massive scale. And
Yeah.
now you're doing independent research on morphogenesis and category theory. I want to understand your mental model behind this. So, I mean, do these feel the same kind of thinking, or are they genuinely? I mean, of course, they are different domain, but how's your mental modeling behind working around these subjects?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think I tend to think they're very similar in a way. I think, for distributed systems and just like overall, like kind of platform engineering, as is done in like the recent like 10 years, like the Netflixes of the world, for example, it's like, famous platform engineering team. Like, I think my style there in this kind of systems is, I was lucky, I think, to have the nice opportunities where there was just enough time that I could think deeply about the thing before having to do it. And so I think when I built most of the very large systems that I did in the last, I would say since 2021, and I stopped around a year ago, I kind of, let's say, reduced my position quite a bit, and I'm much more of a just around, to help with design and just, people. But in the first 3 years, what I try to do is, I mean, there were business needs. One of them is the eternal business need, which is we need to make money, more money, and then obviously we need to keep delivering a better product. And there was a bunch of ways that people thought that we should solve this problem. And what I did is I spent a large amount of time with the C levels and the SVPs and stuff like that, and I basically try to figure out what is it that they actually want. I mean, what is it that we? Because I mean, if you wanted more money, there's lots of ways to do that, but not all of them are equal. And like, I was trying to understand what is it that they actually want. And so I got to spend 2 or 3 months designing, basically, which was a very nice period. And a lot of these guys in the team that ended up being formed, I've told me or others afterwards that it was like the best time of their career, which is really cool because I was a very, I think, a typical kind of leader in that I was incredibly passionate about what we were trying to do. I really thought I could see what was actually needed, and I had some path to get there, and I had a couple ideas on the way, two or three like system design decisions that like were the big pillars that we would end up building on. But yeah, I'm not gonna continue too long on that, and I'll make the analogy with what I do now. Certainly, the mental aspect I think is very similar in that, like I just try to spend a lot of time with first of all the day-to-day problem of like working, both at the lab here and like at the job, just trying to understand what is it that I actually mean to do and whatever is necessary within the constraints I have. Like not all problems are of the same shape. Very often, I would like to design things in such a way that the solution doesn't really attack the problem, but like it just renders the problem like not really a thing that exists at all. It's not. It's been designed out of existence. It's not possible for the problem to exist. And for the lab, it's been nice because we're just two people. I can move really really fast, and I can also there is no we're in talks with some grants and things like that, and we'll see in August we might get a very cool grant, and that's very exciting. But we have not raised any money. We don't have any things, and so I can spend the time on what I think matters, which is not always what really matters, but certainly in that way that's very similar. In that I design things the same way, regardless of like kind of the scale or the context. In the kind of like substrate, in the thing that they are. I mean, there's certainly like similarities. Again, like collective intelligence, the way that Levin like thinks of these different agents, like let's say cells as n agents navigating some kind of like anatomical space, or physical bunch of different spaces. It's really like it's very similar to what you could imagine as a of any kind of decentralized system, and the kind of like the fact that there is no central controller, and how do you communicate so that everything kind of like reaches the end destination. So there are some analogies, but I guess I don't spend so much about that. I don't think too much about them, mostly because I think like I never had to. It's like kind of like automatic, I think mostly about like okay, get lean, get it to run, get it to run all these things, get these static providers, like look at the data, and then like iterate and things like that. Or like in other fields of research is like for example, I spent a bunch of time like optimizing like metal kernels, Apple metal kernels for like some computations, because we have a bunch of Apple hardware. And then at the same time, I take these like very long 2 to 3 weeks like engineering like tunnels, where I'm just like kind of manically working in all the directions that I think matter. And then I have these like kind of retraction periods where I've done so much, my brain is used up, and I've seen too many things, and yeah. And then I have these retraction periods where maybe it's a weekend, or a single day, or sometimes it's a little more, where I just have to like basically try to not touch anything, and like really sit with my thoughts, and think about what have I done, what does it mean, and why is the next thing that I think is next, like why is that next, like what am I trying to do. And I have to remind myself of like the kind of like the questions that I'm asking, I think. Yeah.
Very amazing. Great to hear that. Also, there is this culture problem going, if I have to say, if I have to differentiate the signal versus noise in ML research. So also you wrote that the public face of ML is dominated by VCs and content leeches, while the actually brilliant people are logged inside the companies or destroyed by social media incentives. You also
Yeah.
called out Kapathy, who joined Anthropic as MTS directly for the vibe coding coinage and cursor shilling. So do you think I mean, I'm just curious about what are thoughts around this, and because this is something which gonna be matter, because it's the frontier, and everyone who's coming into the space have will always have dual thought, what to trust and what not to trust.
Um, yeah. So I remember when I wrote this. This was a while ago, but I remember I was frustrated, and I often am frustrated with the culture in machine learning, just the industry as a whole in computer science. I mean, but ML is just interesting because it's so accelerated, right? It's a very compact version of other things that have happened. I can think of two on different time scales that are similar. Is the crypto industry, and then in some other ways on a much longer time scale in different ways, but the video game industry. And so both of them, there's this sense of Flanderization, and like where you kind of become like you become some kind of parody of what you were. You just exacerbate the three or four things that were the most effective. And in ML, I mean, I think it's been fascinating to see over the last 3 years, like the sheer amount of people who really came out of nowhere and are dictating, that they are really dictating like thoughts at a large scale. There's a bunch of content creators and people on X and YouTube who, I mean, it's always like a very, it's always like, it's most of the time it's just regurgitation. They're just regurgitating other things. They have some capacity, most of them, to feel the current collective unconscious and what they think, and then they have their own like little preferred signals of people they really believe, and then they regurgitate that to some extent. But I think it's been very very sad, the kind of like mania. I mean, you can see a lot of these. I've met a bunch of them, from state of the art labs, and the kind of like mindset that there's a lot of good people at these labs. I will say, first of all, there's some very sensible people, but there's also a lot of a lot of very very, in my opinion, very terrible people who are taking some kind of, I mean, they're manic in some way. They're lost in like very large ideologies, and they're not making a lot of sense, and they're also kind of like ruining, I think, something that's quite wonderful by disguising it, or dressing it up, packaging it with their own angle, which is very sad. A good example is the unit point distance disproof from ChatGPT 5.6 Pro, assumedly, which is a wonderful result. It's very neat, but it's not. I mean, it's not. This was not a fundamental like theorem of discrete geometry, and I don't think that people, obviously many people tried. I think if you took the guys that reviewed the original proof from ChatGPT and you put them in a room, they would have disproved it. Also, there was just never the brain power. Like I mean, it just wasn't especially like that relevant in a way. And but that doesn't mean it's not fucking awesome. It is really awesome. It's actually incredible. It's completely incredible. But you don't have to lie about what it means. And I think this is what I got frustrated on earlier last week is the way that it's packaged, and the very like vulture like people who just come in and just like get to like throw their pop culture points on it, like of like well this and that is going to happen, and like or aren't they wrong, and like the stochastic parrots, like don't you feel stupid now? And it's like, well, first of all, stochastic parrot, really good stochastic parrot would have done great at disproving this. That would have been very useful. But there's large problems in this culture. I also think it's like super hard to navigate. I mean, I'm very mean to these kids in SF who are like deep into it. But the truth is, I mean, I know a bunch of kids who moved to SF in the last 2 years. Some of them fell apart. I'm not very close with them now. One of them was a very close mutual of mine who's really been submerged. And it's very normal. You move in at 17, 16. I mean, those are very young kids. There's a lot of money around, and there are really great rhetoric and speakers around. People who are very nice to listen to, and they make a lot of sense. And they're saying things that like play on like the most cliche human sensitivities. Like, I mean, it's like obviously it's very easy to get caught up. And one other thing that empowers them, I think, is that they're not entirely wrong. Like, they're not entirely wrong. I mean, there is something really, really, really special happening. It is very, very important, and working on it is very, very cool. And and all that. But the point is, they still get caught up a little too much, and so it uglifies everything in the end. Yeah.
Makes sense. Absolutely. So the next and the final segment of the pod is the community questions we have got, and I mean we can keep the answers to them very short. I mean because there are a bunch of them. So this is the first question we got from HSV Sphere itself. So if you were to join an intelligence agency of any government in the world, which one would it be?
What he thinks I would answer is correct. I would probably join Mossad. Yeah.
True.
Probably
Okay.
join Mossad.
So there is this question about the learning being meta completely inverted. Instead of grinding theory bottom up and then applying it, you now go top down. So
Yeah.
building the application first with LLMs and then patching up the theory as you go. So do you agree with that frame? And is that how learning works now?
Yeah, I think I do agree. I mean, you have to have balance in that. Probably an entirely top-down approach is not the best, and you have to. It depends on your capacity to keep yourself honest. Also, like it's not a given that if you do top-down, so you're building all these applications, and then you're like, oh wait, I don't even know how that works. What's TCP/IP again or something? I mean, it's not a given that you're going to look back and be rigorous enough to really patch up. These holes. but it doesn't not make sense. I mean, it's hard to advise the kids who were talking to me about, like, should I use LLMs for this game engine I'm building, or, like, I felt kind of bad. Like, I mean, I could get so much more. It's like, well, it depends on why you're doing it. Obviously, if you're doing it for like a raw learning experience and stuff like that, you should probably still use LLM to learn. But building it yourself is probably better. Like, build a ray tracer in a weekend or whatever, and like, yeah. But yeah, that's my answer. Is yes, I agree. I think it's not a bad way. Just keep yourself honest and mix it up. Bottom up is good sometimes. If you only go top down, you will miss the connecting links. You have to spend time with the foundations also. Yeah.
Very true. What are Ludwig's three pointers on how to not be ass at coding?
Well, I doubt anybody would think they're not ass at coding to some extent, but I mean, it's a very unbounded skill, and it's also like both a soft and a hard skill. Like, there's a lot of like very, very soft things in programming, but one is, for me, it was predominantly about being with better programmers than me. You have to find people who already realize some of what you want to be, and then you get close to them. And if you have nothing to offer, be very silent and serviceable. You know, and that's I think that's the first pointer is, yeah, find better people than you and stick around with them. You will passively learn about why is it that they think the way they do, they approach things the way they do. If you can sit next to someone's computer while they're interacting with it and they're opening up like Helix or whatever, or like Z, and they start programming, that will be tremendously useful. Another thing maybe is, this is a little harder because it's not in the act of programming, it's after the fact, but there's a lot of wonderful code out there that's open source. There's a lot of wonderful, like, Rust crates, for example. If you want to learn Rust, there's a plethora of incredible Rust crates with incredible ideas. And versus what it was like a couple of years ago, now you can ask LLMs to kind of, help you walk through them, and kind of like, get a sense of some of the larger ideas and why were things designed that way, and some of the deeper features that they might be using. And so find good people, look at good code, and then for the third one, I would say, if the code delivers on the metrics that you're quantifying, then it is good code to some extent, and so that's really all that matters. You can add the human component, to the thing of like how maintainable it is and how blah blah blah, and how does it compose with other, sure. But at the end of the day, if the code does what it does, and all the kind of metrics you're looking at are the things that you expect, then maybe, unless it is very important, you should not care too much. Yeah.
Very true. So the next question is, so your honest take on the primacy of shape rotator versus wordcel.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't remember. I had an interesting post maybe a year ago or something, on wordcells versus shape rotators, where I had this epiphany, but I don't remember what the epiphany was. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty bad distinction. Like, I mean, it's a toxic distinction too. Like, there's a lot of very proud shape rotators on X, and I usually find them incredibly limited. I mean, it's like, first of all, I mean, if your predominant personality trait is that you're a really good computer, I mean, you are very cooked. Computers are pretty incredible now, and they're able to do things with some degree of autonomy. And, like, you know what I mean? Like, if all you are is a very nice compute bag, then yeah, that's not very good. But that's not always what people mean by shape rotator. I think it's very important, maybe not to be a word cell, but to be broad. It's important to be broad, and it's important to look around. It's important to look around you, and to look maybe like pretty far away from the things you look at. You most likely will be a better shape rotator by doing that also. Certainly, every single time that I've done that, I've came back to the things that I usually do with much more vivid capacity to model things and visualize them and be able to, like, predict how they will be. And so that's very important. I don't think that's a real answer, but yeah, that's my answer for now.
Sounds great. What got you into Tenstorrent?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the time I was looking to like buy some compute around like 10,000-15,000 bucks, and I wanted to have like, some compute to maybe run like local inference. This was maybe 2024, and I was looking around, and I knew Jim Keller since a kid. I was a big fan of Jim Keller when I was a kid, and I had heard that he was doing this Tenstorrent thing, but like, not super closely and stuff like that. And then looking around, I was like, oh shit, like Tenstorrent is a company. They have actually shipped some hardware. I can look at the software stack, and that seems interesting. And I started, posting about it, and they were very nice. They reached out, we talked a little bit, and then when I got the Loudbox, I think that the appeal for me is like, it's a tinkerer's paradise. So I'm not the best advocate for tension that I wouldn't I don't know that I would recommend it to everyone, but certainly it's very, very nice that you have complete access to everything top to bottom. It's very, very, it feels good, and it's nice to hack on. And by the way, philosophically, I think it's an important company. I think the design, hardware wise, is excellent. I think the software has some issues, but it's going to substantially better. It's also like much more pleasing to work with now. And most importantly, I mean, they have a design that is not locked into a specific architecture, that's performant energy wise, that scales incredibly well. And they want you to be able to own it and modify it however you want, which in a world where, a 5.5 like model or 4.7 Opus fits on a 1 or 2 graphics card fairly soon, I think, in the next 8-9 months. That is pretty good. That is pretty important. There's no. I mean, you should only like OpenAI and Anthropic and these other companies insofar as they're useful to you. But there's no telling they will keep being useful, or kind to you. If they start getting access, you'll be happy, and you can choose, AMD and Apple and Nvidia and stuff like that. But you do lose something in that you don't have the entire stack available to you. You can't just do whatever you want with it.
Awesome. Do you think good graph parallel processes will eventually cause a leap in compute capabilities similar to what we got from pixel parallel processors?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I can answer that question very well. I think it's a very, could give you my personal opinion, but I don't think it's very valuable. It's very hard to tell what's going to happen in the computing world and with hardware design. It's very
True.
hard to tell. And also like the current momentum and money and giants that are around, I mean, they will dictate whatever computing looks like. And so, if maybe is my answer. Not a very good answer, but yeah.
True. Okay. Makes sense. What are your three bullets on how to hire great engineers in 2026?
In 2026, that's hard. That's hard. You got to talk to them. You got to meet them, first of all. You got to talk to them and spend some time with them. I think that like that hasn't changed much over the last years. But like, I mean, if you have a well-tuned sense of people to some extent, and you talk to someone for an hour or two over a technical interview, and you're not just testing how good of a compute bag they are or how good of a memorization machine they are, but you're discussing things technically, and you're probing their way that they think and model the world, and the way that they translate that into moving around on their computer and starting to solve a problem, and you do that with them, and you try to sense just their capacity to be a general thinker to some extent. That still remains to me the best way to hire great engineers. You want a great general thinker. It might be that you need a pair of hands for a very specific task, and then at this point you're not looking for a great engineer, you're just looking for a pair of hands, which you hire by doing the typical things. If you're looking for a great engineer, you're looking for a great engineer. And so it's someone who's going to be a very capable thinker, even if they're very young, if they don't know much. You can sense that pretty quickly. I had an experience with a young developer who was from an acquisition, who most of these people were let go, and he was around, and my CTO was like, hey, like you should meet him, he's a Unity developer, and I was like, I don't care about Unity, I don't even know. And I talked to the kid, and I told him what we were building, and I told him about this distributed systems and the scale and like the kind of like pipelines and things that we were doing. And he was very honest. He was like, well, I don't know that, and I don't know this, and I've never heard of that, and stuff like that. But I was just trying to see who he was, and the impression that I got was, well, this is a very smart kid, and I don't think what we do is that complicated, and I think he would do very well. And we onboarded him, and now he's wonderful. It's been 3 years, and he has his own team, and he's doing great, and and he's a real distributed engineer, and he's building things at very large scales. 150 million checks per second on his system, just very large scales. So that's very neat. And yeah, that's it.
I mean, yeah, makes sense. We are in the series of very last questions. So, what would you do with the models a year from now, assuming similar trajectory in the capabilities which are happening right now? And basically, if I have to turn up the question, what is the major bottleneck you see in the models right now, which you
Yeah,
want to be better? It can be across domain, a closed source
yeah,
environment, or anything sort of.
yeah. But yeah, what would I do with the models, assuming like the same rate of growth and capacity a year from now is hard to imagine. I mean, I think like this year especially, it's pretty insane what I've done. I mean, I think not last month, but last month, I went over 100 billion tokens for the first time. And a lot of the things, or very recently, I mean, I had this post on like, it was like an 80-hour slash goal on Codex, right? And it produced at the end around 63,000 lines of code and removed around 20,000. So it was a very small output, but it ran for 80 hours. And the thing, the way that I built the scaffolding around it was fairly specific, but it was incredible. It would have taken me substantially longer than 80 hours to do it. And from a research perspective, with the kind of things I'm doing, of like, that's been even like, when trying to find papers and things and ideas and stuff like that. I mean, I can't imagine what I would be able to do. I assume that this is what I'm trying to do, is that I'm trying to build up a life where I have like the kind of mental space necessary to do the things that will be left to do. I think that's mostly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to become a sharper thinker. I'm trying to be less periodic in my capacity to think sharply, and I'm trying to write more so that I can put it on paper and understand, really force myself to cast down in this symbolic way. And so I'm preparing, for a world where outside of the 25 plus codex sessions going around and all the, I've had slash goals running right now. I can tell you live what's the, let's see on this one. So this goal finished in 23 hours, 23 minutes, and 39 seconds.
What you were running for 23 hours? I'm curious. What you were running for 23 hours? I'm curious about the goal thing.
Well, this was a kind of like this was a discovery goal. I'm working on this thing, like some continuous automata called linear flow, which is like a nice like continuous version of game of life, basically. And in there, you can choose some parameters for to start, kind of like the squares that you'd click in a game of life, and then you press play and you see what happens. And I'm trying to map out a lot of the kind of like species of creatures that you can find. And there's a lot of very interesting creatures, kind of like artificial little organisms that look, strikingly organic. And for 29 hours, I asked it to basically use the things that I built, plus a couple, like, kind of a search pipeline with map elites and QD search and a bunch of stuff, to continuously search a space, a parameter, and get me tons of feedback on the way of like the kind of things it's looking for, and basically building a taxonomy. So I did that for 29 hours, which is something that I couldn't even have done if I had unlimited time, because it's just like, it's not, I would have chosen another way, like I would not have done that.
Awesome.
But yeah.
Which codex song is the best?
Which Kodak song is the best? Probably from Heartbreak Kodak. That's my favorite album from him. Let me check the title. Do you mind if I check the title on that Heartbreak album? From, yeah, let me just check. It's like the third or second track. But I'm like an album listener. So Hate Being Alone. There we go. Hate Being Alone. Third track from Heartbreak Kodak. That's my favorite song. I think that's the best. I like when he sings.
Patty cake.
Sorry?
Someone has mentioned why it is patty cake.
Oh yeah. That's that wow.
Awesome. Like, okay, if just going through the some question which just came on my mind. What are the some three good companies you really like the work of, on when you're scrolling Twitter, you kind of go and just see their work. If you have something in mind to tell.
Yeah, I mean, I like Planet Scale because I like Sam. I like Sam Lambert. I think he's an interesting person. I still like Cloudflare a lot. I still like Cloudflare a lot. I think that maybe over the last year and a half, like the collective has changed their mind a bit on
Mind
them.
is what you pronounced, the first company or the person.
Planet Scale.
Oh, Planet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
And so I like these two for sure. There's a couple smaller ones. In Tenstorrent, of course. Oh, in AI? I mean, in AI, if I had to choose a lab, I would say OpenAI. I still believe OpenAI is the best lab. I mean, I like DeepMind a lot. I think DeepMind has, from outside looking in on like their perception, I think them owning the Gemini team has hurt them, like from a perception perspective. So I don't think they're as shiny and cool as they used to be. Because the Gemini team is very anti DeepMind. It's not the kind of long shots, and But OpenAI is like the lab that I believe has been the most useful for me.
How about Chinese Frontier?
Oh, Chinese Frontier, yeah. I mean, big fan of Quan and DeepSeek. I love Quan. I love Quan models for a long while now, and the latest, the 27B version is amazing. It's really good. It's really, really good, and I get very solid TPS, around like 35 to 50 TPS locally, and it's been very useful. I'm very thankful that the Chinese Frontier exists and that they are doing things, because without them, it is very likely that we would go into a complete paywall and garden that some people can't access. So very excited for them to keep. And I hope they distill every single model and they still change of thoughts. I'm rooting for them. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, this is the last question of the podcast, and so I mean, as we understand, the world is pacing up so high, AI is accelerating so much. I mean, pretty much not everyone is aware about, but at least we can see how Frontier is doubling down every week, every month. So, what's your advice to someone who is 20, who is in college, who is just getting started? Because, I mean, every other day there is news that this company is laying off, there's been shortage of people, like companies are optimizing for less hires as the Frontier goes up. So, what they should focus on, what they should work on, I mean, what are the prospects which are, I mean, opening up, or they should chase on basically to work around? What do you think about it? I mean, imagine if you have been a kid in, let's say, 20 or so. I mean, makes sense you
Yeah,
have not been to college or
yeah,
school, but anyways, like a majority of people are been in this loophole, I think.
yeah. No, that's totally fair. That's a very important question, I think. Well, if I was as broke as I was, I would find the shortest path to make the most money, because it seems palatable enough. Now, the shortest path, in my case, I think in many people's cases, is not so trivial, in that it is a pretty competitive space, and you're not joining up an AI, just walking in, right? Like, that's going to be pretty hard, especially as a young person who doesn't have like any credentials or ICMLR papers or whatever. So that's going to be a little hard. But there's certainly, like, many other like alternatives and like smaller labs, that might take a shot. But you have to be sharp, and you have to provide something that they want. But my overall advice in general, because of how fast things are changing, is to build yourself to be a capable thinker. You do not want to content yourself too much to like a set of skills or a specific thing. It's not very valuable now to be like, I don't know, a great, specific programming language or specific niche or of anything. It's only valuable still insofar that it makes you maybe a more capable thinker. But I would advise on broadening yourself and fleshing out your role model and your understanding of how things work, so that you can be capable enough, so that no matter what really happens, as long as there is any use for humans whatsoever, you can be useful. You should also anchor and figure out your system of values to some extent. I think that's there are periods in life where you can maximize one thing or the other. You can spend a couple of years maximizing money and doing things you hate. Over a long period of time, at some point, you hopefully will have enough money that you can make choices that you would make if you didn't have any constraints. And then you should think about, like, what is it that matters to you, and you should try to figure that out. So yeah, be a capable thinker. Understand that there's a lot of time if you're 20, massive amount of time, and you have you're more than 20,000 days left. So a lot of time. Things will change regardless of what happens with AI. Things will change for you, and it's okay to have periods of N years where things are not the way you want. And I would really try to care about the right things, even if in the short term it's like, okay, make money, be in the wave of AI, like, to join a great lab or whatever. A lot of these things don't really matter, and I would focus on figuring out what matters to you over the longest run. Yeah,
Absolutely. That's a wrap. I didn't realize how this 2 hours, I mean,
yeah,
around 2 hours of the conversation passed by. It was such a sort of unusual conversation we have been going through. I mean, I mean, I really like the kind of experience you have brought in, the kind of, I mean, your trajectory has been. I think it is very inspirational, and how you think about systems, and not just thinking about a singular system, but it goes beyond the trajectory of multiple subjects. I think it has been really inspirational and resourceful. I think lots and lots of people in audience would also be kind of get inspiration from. Thanks for joining us. So for
thank you.
people, I mean, thanks for coming who have listened to this podcast. For everyone listening, you can follow Ludwig. He's pretty famous on Axe, and read everything at his webpage. It's I mean, there's a plethora of resources, bookmarks, readings, writings has been posted. Amazing. Thanks for joining, Ludwig. It's been awesome to have you.
It's very nice. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so I am stopping the pod.
All
Give me a
right.
second.
Yep.